What titles belong on a list of the greatest movies of all time? That's a question Sight and Sound magazine tries to answer every 10 years when it conducts a poll of directors. In the most recent poll from 2022, directors named a wide range of movies that they thought deserved to be considered the greatest. The picks span more than a century and cover everything from horror movies to musicals. There's no one film that every director agrees should be on the list. Even the top pick was named by just more than 60% of respondents. But 100 years ago, there was a lot more consensus. When one popular film magazine asked a group of experts to name the best movies ever made, they all agreed on only one entry, The Covered Wagon. The magazine also asked its readers, and they ranked The Covered Wagon as the third best movie ever made, behind only The Birth of a Nation and The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Across the country, The Covered Wagon was hailed as a masterpiece. This Oregon Trail epic was unlike any movie that had been seen before. The apex of the cinematic art, as one critic wrote. Another called it the first real American epic of the screen. The praise sent people flocking to cinemas, making The Covered Wagon the highest-grossing movie of the year. It earned more than $600,000 from one single theater, the Criterion in New York, where it had a record-breaking 59-week run. Overall, it brought in around $4 million, a feat that only a few movies had managed. It's difficult to overstate just how big The Covered Wagon was in 1923. You can get some sense of its popularity by looking at all the things it was used to sell. Everything from trucks to real estate. In Washington, D.C., President Warren G. Harding held a screening of The Covered Wagon at the White House. Harding had only a few months to live, but he didn't know that. He was just focused on watching his new favorite movie. Later in a speech, he said, "Not very long ago, I saw The Covered Wagon, the moving picture. I sat entranced." The Covered Wagon also became the favorite film of a 14-year-old boy in Japan, who was such a big fan of the movies that he would walk for miles to watch them. Years later, that boy, whose name was Tomoyuki Tanaka, would go on to be the film producer who brought Godzilla to the screen. In short, people in 1923 really loved The Covered Wagon. I think that if the Academy Awards had started a few years earlier, there was a very good chance that The Covered Wagon would have been the first Best Picture winner. As it was, it won the Photoplay Medal of Honor, the first major annual award for movies. People back then saw The Covered Wagon and were convinced that it was a masterpiece, a major breakthrough for cinema. One critic's review summed things up nicely.
If all the thousands of motion pictures that have been produced, and all the enormous theaters that have been erected to show them, and all the millions of dollars that have been invested in the industry were suddenly blotted from the face of the earth, then the vast treasure so spent would have been well invested if only one film, The Covered Wagon, survived to posterity. It stands preeminent from sheer immensity of theme.
Some critics said The Covered Wagon was the most important film since The Birth of a Nation, which had been released 8 years earlier. And yet, while The Birth of a Nation remains one of the most famous and infamous movies of the silent era, The Covered Wagon has faded into relative obscurity. It's often left out when critics or fans list the best silent films. When Paste magazine compiled a list of the 75 best films of the 1920s, The Covered Wagon was nowhere to be seen. When users of the website SilentEra.com voted on the 100 best silent movies, again The Covered Wagon didn't make the cut. Even on a list of the best movies about the Oregon Trail, it's overlooked. That's like someone in the future making a list of the best Titanic movies and leaving off James Cameron's 1997 blockbuster. Why was this movie once so incredibly popular and esteemed, and why is it being largely forgotten today? I decided I needed to investigate this, so I headed to my local video store to rent a copy of The Covered Wagon. An employee told me I was the first person to take it out in over a year. For those unfamiliar with The Covered Wagon, picture the classic educational game The Oregon Trail being made into a silent movie. People in wagons heading west, fording rivers and hunting for food. Watching this movie in 2024, it's difficult to understand why it was once such a phenomenon. It certainly has beautiful landscapes, and, living up to its title, a ridiculous number of covered wagons. I don't think any movie made before or since has assembled so many. But compared to other westerns that I've watched, The plot is very basic. The characters are mostly one-dimensional. Some of the action scenes are intercut with obviously fake shots that take away from the realism. But to understand why this movie was important, a bit of context is required. The Covered Wagon was far from the first Western. In 1923, the genre was already more than 20 years old. But earlier Westerns had usually been fairly low budget. The Covered Wagon raised the bar in terms of ambition. I think a rough comparison you could make is that the Covered Wagon is to the Western genre what 1978 Superman is to superhero movies. Hollywood had already been making superhero movies for decades, but they were generally pretty low budget. Superman, which cost $55 million to make, was the first time a studio made such a major investment in a superhero movie. A similar thing happened with Westerns. One thing that attracted Hollywood to the genre was that the movies could be made for a pretty reasonable price. In 1918, star William S. Hart and producer Thomas Ince made 9 feature-length Westerns for a total of around $444,000, or about $48,000 a movie. Collectively, those movies brought in around $920,000, producing a nice profit for Ince and Hart. At the same time, Hollywood was starting to make larger-scale features with ever-increasing budgets. It was a high-risk, high-reward business. In 1922, Douglas Fairbanks' Robin Hood cost around $1 million to make, but it earned $2.5 million at the box office. Today, expensive Hollywood movies will generally open on thousands of screens, but there was a different business model in the silent era. They would open in a few big cities with higher ticket prices, music provided by orchestras, and intermissions. From there, they would spread out across the country, playing limited runs in other cities before finally going into general release with lower-priced tickets. So, for example, if you wanted to watch Robin Hood when it was released in 1922, you could pay $1.50 to see it at the Egyptian Theater in Hollywood. Or you could wait a year and watch it for 35 cents at your local theater. Adjusted for inflation, that would be roughly $27 versus $6.50. Lasky's innovative idea was making a Western on an epic scale and giving it a roadshow release. He'd bought the rights to the popular novel The Covered Wagon with the plan to spend around $100,000 turning it into a movie. But as he read the book while riding a train to Los Angeles, his ambition for the project grew. With The Covered Wagon, Lasky thought he had a movie that could appeal to what he called the very best classes, as well as the masses. As his son explained decades later, Lasky saw the opportunity to create a new kind of Western.
He saw this as the opportunity to lift the Western, which had always been a rather low-budget kind of potboiler film, into an epic.
Unlike other silent epics, The Covered Wagon didn't have huge, elaborate sets. Instead, what made it so expensive was its filming location. A lot of the earliest Westerns were filmed in New Jersey, sometimes resorting to using painted backdrops to provide their scenery. When the film industry shifted west to Hollywood, the scenery of California gave the Western a new and more authentic look. Ince was making his Westerns on a studio ranch known as Inceville. There, just a short drive from Hollywood, he had all the elements needed to pump out a series of inexpensive Westerns, from sets to livestock to a cast of extras that included experienced cowboys and Lakota Sioux brought in from Oklahoma. There had been some ambitious Westerns made before 1923. Maybe most notable among them was William S. Hart's Wagon Tracks, which helped to inspire Lasky's vision. But The Covered Wagon was made on a scale far beyond any Western had come before. To find a suitably rugged landscape, around 3,000 cast and crew were on location in a remote area of Utah, living in tents 85 miles from the nearest railroad. Hundreds of covered wagons were brought in, many of them family heirlooms that a generation or two earlier had been used by people traveling west. Now their descendants were working as extras, earning $2 a day. The potential for the movie to turn into a disaster must have seemed high. The effort to recreate the Oregon Trail became a little too realistic when some members of the cast and crew began to suffer from dysentery. At one point, snow began to fall, a development that was incorporated into the film. Star Lois Wilson recalled suffering from frostbite and being forced to live on apples and baked beans when other food supplies ran out. One of the reasons that it became such a great picture was that we went through a lot of the same hardships that the pioneers had gone through, Wilson said decades later.
And something happened to me. I said, I'm so glad I'm in this picture. This is going to be a great picture. There was something so real about it.
The production had been burning through around $13,000 a day, and a movie that had been budgeted at $336,000 wound up costing more than $780,000. Adjusted for inflation, that's the equivalent of more than $14 million. Spending that much money on a Western in 1923 was a huge gamble. If the Covered Wagon had any hope of turning a profit, it would need to sell tickets at a level far beyond what any previous Western had managed. And fortunately for Lasky, it did. The Covered Wagon did record business in cities across America and around the world. At just one cinema, the Egyptian in Hollywood, 710,000 people paid to see the Covered Wagon over the course of its 34-week run. That works out to 1 in 6 California residents at the time. Why did audiences in the 1920s love the Covered Wagon so much? In part, they were drawn to the sheer spectacle. As one moviegoer said in 1923, quoted by an advertisement,
"While in New York City on a recent buying expedition, I went to see the Covered Wagon at the Criterion Theater. And while I admit that women patrons, as a rule, prefer the so-called society picture best, I came out of the theater with a firm decision in my mind that I had just sat through the greatest picture that I had ever seen. It is indeed too remarkable for me to even attempt to describe."
I looked up Mrs. Scott Drum, and she was a department store buyer in her mid-40s at the time. Exactly the kind of moviegoer that Jesse Lasky would have had in mind with his vision of a Western that could appeal to a more sophisticated audience. The Covered Wagon also tapped into the political mood of 1920s America. As film historian Heidi Kanaga noted, it fit perfectly with a renewal of the ideology of manifest destiny, the belief that settlers were destined to expand westward across the continent. To quote one newspaper editorial from 1923,
"It is fortunate indeed that the cinema people are willing to spend the vast amounts necessary to produce this great historical drama. It is a thing eminently worth doing, even apart from the chance of future profits. It is of incalculable benefit to have this faithful optical demonstration of the source of good Americanism. In this movement, the unique, meritorious, and lasting features which make the West the distinctive part of America had their origin. To it we owe far more than we can fathom, for it gave us inspiration, ideals, and enterprise. How different is that training for citizenship which humanity gets in the slums of Europe and which hands the violent radicalism, which is the curse of our country when transplanted here. The basic merit of the Covered Wagon will doubtless ensure for it a success, which will make it a landmark in the world."
In a country with a growing population of immigrants, the Covered Wagon offered its lesson about American history in the form of a relatable story about making an arduous journey in search of opportunity. As film historian David Lusted writes in his book, The Western, the wagon train Western binds its contemporary audience into the foundational myth of America as a spiritual homeland. The Covered Wagon was promoted as having educational value. Parents who might have complained about their kids wasting their nickels watching other Westerns had no such issues with the Covered Wagon. It was even common to see groups of school children and Boy Scouts being taken to see it. The success of the Covered Wagon changed Hollywood. In their book, The Western, From Silence to the 70s, George N. Fennon and William K. Everson write, in 1923, Westerns were generally out of favor, at their lowest point since the pre-Hart days of 1913. The authors note that 50 Westerns were produced in Hollywood in 1923, a number that nearly tripled for 1924. And Hollywood wasn't just making more Westerns. It followed the example of the Covered Wagon and started making some of them on a much grander scale. Most notable among these Western epics was John Ford's The Iron Horse, released in 1924 and costing over $250,000 to make. Like the Covered Wagon, it told a story grounded in American history, a pattern that subsequent epic Westerns would follow. The Covered Wagon became a gold standard for its genre. For decades afterward, other major Westerns were compared to it. In Old Arizona, the first big-budget sound Western was called The Covered Wagon of the Talking Pictures. The Big Trail, a $1 million movie shot in an early version of widescreen and starring a young John Wayne, was dismissed by Variety as only a noisy covered wagon. In 1931, there was no higher praise for Cimarron than for a critic to call it a greater picture than The Covered Wagon. That movie, the first Western to win the Academy Award for Best Picture, wound up losing money and helped bring to an end the boom in epic westerns that had been ignited by The Covered Wagon. It would take another 8 years for the epic western to boom again, with movies like Stagecoach and Union Pacific. And even then, more than a decade into the sound era, ads made the case for Stagecoach by comparing it to The Covered Wagon. The advertising for another landmark western, 1948's Red River, positioned it as being part of a canon of great westerns that began with The Covered Wagon. In the eyes of one critic, it took 30 years before The Covered Wagon was finally replaced as the greatest western ever made, by 1953's Shane. As late as 1956, critics and ad campaigns were comparing The Searchers to The Covered Wagon. Around that time, there were reports that a remake of The Covered Wagon might be in the works, but that never came to fruition. And then, as the western genre was upended in the 1960s, references to The Covered Wagon seemed to vanish. No one was comparing it with A Fistful of Dollars or The Wild Bunch. The last time I can find someone comparing a new western to The Covered Wagon was this mocking reference to Heaven's Gate made by Liz Smith in 1980. That seems fitting somehow. If The Covered Wagon was the first big-budget epic western, the $44 million Heaven's Gate was one of the last. The western genre is still alive and well, but after a few other pricey flops, I think it may be a long time before we see a western come anywhere close to being the most expensive movie of the year. With the passage of so many decades, The Covered Wagon has fallen out of the canon of what are considered to be the greatest westerns. A list that once started with The Covered Wagon and Cimarron now is much more likely to begin with 1939's Stagecoach. In its day, The Covered Wagon was innovative, but in the decades that followed, audiences became used to seeing big-budget westerns. Then the genre itself began to fade away. It's kind of ironic that in 100 years, the movie industry has come full circle. In 1923, investing heavily in a western was a bold and risky move for a studio. Before The Covered Wagon, there was no precedent for a western costing almost $800,000 and still being able to turn a profit. Today, a lot of people might look at Kevin Costner making $200 million westerns and releasing them back-to-back and see that as a huge gamble. Making Horizon is reportedly a decades-long passion project for Kevin Costner. He had, like Jesse Lasky and James Cruise before him, a vision of recreating the history of the American West at an epic scale on screen. It remains to be seen whether that vision can still resonate with moviegoers. Perhaps it shouldn't be surprising that a 100-year-old movie has faded somewhat into obscurity, but it's even overshadowed by other popular movies from the same year, which have advantages that it lacks. The Ten Commandments was directed by the famous Cecil B. DeMille, who made a Technicolor remake in the 1950s. The Hunchback of Notre Dame has Lon Chaney, one of the silent era's most iconic stars, in one of his best-known roles. And Harold Lloyd's Safety Last features one of the most famous and widely referenced shots of the 1920s. The Covered Wagon doesn't have a star as famous as Chaney, or a director as well known as DeMille. It wasn't remade in Technicolor or referenced by Jackie Chan. The female lead, Lois Wilson, had a solid career, but The Covered Wagon would be her most successful film. Male lead J. Warren Kerrigan had seen his career in decline before The Covered Wagon, but he was unable to really capitalize on its popularity, as a car accident the next year scarred his face and ended his acting career. Director James Cruise initially got a big boost from The Covered Wagon. In 1925, he was voted one of the best directors in Hollywood. At one point, he was the highest paid director in the world. But he was never able to match the huge success of The Covered Wagon, or escape from its shadow. Over a decade later, he was still being described as the director of The Covered Wagon, whether he was trying to promote a new movie, suing a magazine publisher for a story alleging he was living in poverty, or getting married in hospital after suffering a heart attack. When he died in 1942, The Covered Wagon was the first of his films mentioned in this Los Angeles Times article. Cruise, who had once been earning $7,000 a week, left an estate worth less than $1,000. Most silent movies are now sadly lost. If The Covered Wagon was among them, I think it might actually be better known than it is. One of the most famous lost films is London After Midnight. This Lon Chaney vehicle has taken on such a mythical status that it feels unlikely any actual film could ever live up to the version that is in people's minds. Imagine if all we had left of The Covered Wagon were a few photos, newspaper stories about its enormous popularity, and reviews hailing it as the pinnacle of the cinematic art. The Covered Wagon would be a lost masterpiece, a holy grail for fans of the Western. But The Covered Wagon isn't a lost film. It's readily available to watch today, and those who've seen it don't seem to be overly impressed. It's a standard little 1920s Western, as one letterboxed user wrote. To a modern viewer, familiar with the century of Westerns that came in The Covered Wagon's wake, the novelty of its epic scope is gone. Some have even questioned whether The Covered Wagon was ever really good. Because it was such an influential film, the legend seems to have sprung up that it was also a great film, rate film historians Fenton and Everson. In actual fact, The Covered Wagon was, its photography apart, of negligible creative value. Comparing The Covered Wagon to The Iron Horse, the film historians note that while director James Cruise was good at staging action, he lacked John Ford's ability to translate that action to the screen. But another film historian, Kevin Brownlow, rides to the defense of The Covered Wagon. He points out that in 1962, when Fenton and Everson first published their book, the available prints of the movie were incomplete and of poor quality. Brownlow praises the movie for recreating the Oregon Trail as though it were a documentary actually filmed in the 1840s. But even as he defends the movie, Brownlow notes some of its flaws, notably its simplistic plot and the unconvincing performance of its leading man, J. Warren Kerrigan, who Brownlow says was selected for the part mostly because he was friends with the director. Covered Wagon cinematographer Carl Brown told Brownlow that he thought Kerrigan's stunt double would have been better suited for the part. Even 100 years ago, film critics noted some of The Covered Wagon's weaker points. Photoplay magazine, in its otherwise rave review of The Covered Wagon, noted that Wilson and Kerrigan are outshone by supporting players Tully Marshall and Ernest Torrance. A Chicago Tribune review from 1923 said the movie is full of spectacular scenes that are mediocrely presented. If the movie felt a bit basic in 1923, that's all the more apparent today after a century of evolution in the Western genre. If you compare The Covered Wagon to Meek's Cutoff, a more recent movie covering the same subject matter, the contrast is stark. While The Covered Wagon deals in a black and white morality of good and evil, Meek's Cutoff is more nuanced and ambiguous. While The Covered Wagon celebrates the idea of manifest destiny, Meek's Cutoff turns a more critical eye to how Native people were impacted by the Oregon Trail. The Covered Wagon is a foundational film to the Western genre, but it's a foundation that's been buried by a century of more sophisticated Westerns. A silent Western is kind of a tough sell to a modern viewer. If you want to watch a Western, you'd probably prefer one with more well-developed characters and narrative. But The Covered Wagon has beautiful landscapes, but movies like The Searchers or Unforgiven can give you that and a deeply flawed and compelling main character. If you want to watch a silent movie, you can choose from titles like The Gold Rush or Sunrise that feel like perfectly realized examples of their respective genres, and not just rudimentary early steps towards something bigger. I think one lesson we can take from The Covered Wagon is how difficult it is to assess the lasting cultural legacy of a work of art. 100 years ago, critics saw The Covered Wagon and were ready to proclaim it as one of the greatest movies of all time. But it's interesting to consider that in 1923, cinema was less than 30 years old. It makes me think back to lists being made in the 1990s of the greatest video games of all time. At that point, the video game as an art form was roughly as old as cinema was in 1923. Looking back from a few decades later, games like Tetris and Monkey Island are still solid picks for any best of all time list. But there are a lot of other games that haven't aged quite as well. When that panel of experts in 1923 was asked to list the best movies of all time, they limited themselves mostly to recent releases. Of the 31 titles they named, 20 were from the last 3 years, and only one was more than 10 years old. For those experts, it was impossible to compare a movie like The Covered Wagon with one made just 20 years earlier, like The Great Train Robbery. They also overlooked some movies that are widely celebrated today, like Nosferatu. Now when anyone sets out to list the greatest movies ever, a much wider range is being considered. The most recent Sight and Sound Critics poll contains movies ranging from the 1920s to the 2000s. If people are still watching movies in another 100 years, I'm sure they'll still be making these kinds of lists. Almost inevitably, most of our current movies will be largely forgotten. Only a select few recent titles will make the cut as part of the canon of what are considered to be the greatest and most important films. Will Oppenheimer be enshrined as a timeless masterpiece like Citizen Kane? Or like its fellow Best Picture winner, the great Ziegfeld? Will its reputation fade over time? I guess the lesson from the Covered Wagon is that we don't know. If a movie that won awards and critical acclaim, broke box office records and transformed the genre can fall into obscurity, then any movie can. In the end, we should be glad that the Covered Wagon still exists for us to watch, even if we can't see in it exactly what people did a century ago.